The late afternoon sun bled through the grime-streaked windows of the garage, casting long shadows across the oil-stained floor. A silver supercar, looking like a shard of a fallen star, sat on a flatbed truck outside. Vanessa Blake, a sharp-edged CEO in expensive silk, stepped down and sneered at the humble workshop. In the corner, a man in a grease-stained gray t-shirt was focused on an old truck. "Who's the head mechanic?" she demanded. Daniel Cruz looked up, wiping oil from his brow. "That would be me." Vanessa laughed. "You? This engine costs more than this entire place." Daniel Cruz was 41 years old, but his hands told the story of a much longer life. They were rough, calloused, and permanently etched with the dark lines of industrial labor, lines that no amount of heavy-duty soap could ever fully erase. To the residents of this quiet suburb, he was just Dan the mechanic, the reliable, somewhat quiet single father who ran the small garage on the corner. He was the man you called when your radiator hissed or your brakes squealed, a steady fixture in a world of moving parts. But Daniel's past was built on a foundation of high-performance engineering that most people in town couldn't even fathom. Years ago, he had been a lead designer for the very company that manufactured the car sitting on his lift, a titan of industry. He had been a rising star, a man who spoke the language of combustion, fluid dynamics, and aerodynamics better than anyone in the business. He lived in a world of wind tunnels, carbon fiber composites, and digital simulations. But life has a way of shifting gears when you least expect it, stripping away the polish to reveal the raw metal beneath. The transition from corporate elite to local mechanic hadn't been an easy road, but it was a necessary one. Every morning, as he opened the heavy iron doors of the shop, he felt a sense of purpose that the boardroom never provided. The smell of old transmission fluid and the rhythmic clinking of his tools became his new symphony. He didn't miss the cold, sterile perfection of the lab. He preferred the honest grime of a hard day's work. When his wife, Sarah, faced life-threatening complications during the birth of their daughter, Mia, Daniel's perspective fractured. The high-stakes world of corporate engineering suddenly felt hollow. The late nights in the lab and the relentless pursuit of faster and lighter seemed insignificant compared to the fragile life in the hospital bassinet. He didn't hesitate. He walked away from the prestige, the glass towers, and the six-figure bonuses. He traded the sterile corporate environment for a small workshop filled with the scent of old iron and the honesty of manual labor. He chose a life where he could be home every single day to pack a school lunch, to walk his daughter to the park, and to be the anchor she needed. Mia was now 8 years old, a bright, energetic girl who was the undisputed heartbeat of Daniel's world. She often sat at a small, cluttered desk in the corner of the shop, her crayons mingling with stray bolts and washers, drawing vibrant pictures of super trucks while her father worked. Daniel's garage wasn't flashy. It lacked the neon signs and high-tech diagnostic suites of the city's premium dealerships. It was a place of iron, sweat, and meticulous care. His customers were mostly local workers, plumbers, teachers, delivery drivers, people who relied on their vehicles to survive. Daniel treated every rusted sedan with the same reverence he once gave to million-dollar prototypes. He wasn't interested in fame anymore. He was interested in being the father Mia deserved. He had learned that the most complex machine in the world was the heart of a child, and that was the only project he refused to fail. When the silver supercar arrived, shimmering like a mirage against the backdrop of the dusty street, Daniel's assistant, a young man named Leo, looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Boss, is that—" Leo trailed off. They both knew what that car represented. It was a pinnacle of engineering that required specialized tools and proprietary software. One wrong move could result in a repair bill that would bankrupt the shop 3 times over. The customers waiting in the lobby whispered, watching the interaction between the elegant woman and the grease-covered mechanic. They saw a man who looked like he belonged in a basement and a woman who looked like she stepped off a private jet. But Daniel felt no intimidation. He had spent his life listening to the heartbeat of engines. He knew that beneath the polished silver exterior and the expensive trim, this car was suffering. He didn't see a status symbol. He saw a puzzle that needed solving. Vanessa Blake watched him, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her suspicion radiating like heat. She saw a man who didn't fit her definition of success. She didn't realize that the man in front of her had helped write the very blueprints for the engine she was so proud of. Vanessa Blake didn't have time for local charm or small-town stories. She was the CEO of a tech conglomerate valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, a woman who operated on a global scale. Her life was a blur of board meetings, private jets, and high-pressure negotiations where weakness was never an option. She was used to dealing with world-class experts who wore tailored Italian suits and spoke in complex jargon. To her, this garage was a desperate, humiliating last resort, a place suggested by a tow truck driver who probably didn't know a spark plug from a lug nut. "I've already had 3 senior engineers from the main dealership look at this," she said, her voice projecting across the quiet workshop with the cold authority of a courtroom judge. "They are the best in the city, the elite team, and even they couldn't identify the source of the vibration. They ran every diagnostic tool in the catalog and told me the engine might need a full factory replacement, a 3-month process. I don't have 3 months." Daniel walked around the car slowly, his eyes scanning the lines of the bodywork, his fingers lightly brushing the vents. He wasn't looking at the paint, he was looking at the tolerances. He could feel the heat radiating from the block, a restless energy that felt out of balance. To his trained ear, even the silence of the engine felt heavy. "What exactly did they try?" he asked softly, his voice a stark contrast to her sharp tone. Vanessa let out an exasperated sigh, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "Everything. They checked the fuel mapping, replaced the oxygen sensors, recalibrated the ECU 3 times, and even swapped out the injectors. It's a ghost in the machine, Mr. Cruz. That's what they called it. I'm only here because the driver insisted you were some kind of local magician. But looking at this place, I think he was exaggerating for a tip." She leaned against a workbench, visibly flinching as she realized there might be dust on the surface. "This engine is a proprietary V12, the Apex series," she continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's an exclusive piece of technology that utilizes ceramic-coated internals and a variable geometry intake. It's not something you can fix with a hammer and a prayer. This machine is worth more than your house, your shop, and probably this entire block." Daniel didn't respond to the insult. He didn't feel the need to defend his bank account, his choice of profession, or his humble surroundings. He had found a peace that didn't require external validation. He simply reached into the cabin, avoiding the pristine leather with practiced care, and popped the hood. The engine bay was a masterpiece of industrial art, packed so tightly with chrome, carbon fiber, and braided lines that it looked impossible to service. Vanessa followed him, her assistant recording the interaction on a high-end smartphone, likely preparing for an insurance dispute. "This is ridiculous," she whispered to her aide, loud enough for Daniel to hear. "We're wasting time. He's going to break something, and then we'll have a legal nightmare on top of a broken car." Daniel ignored the chatter. He didn't reach for a laptop or a scanning tool. Instead, he leaned over the engine bay, his face inches from the intake manifold. He inhaled deeply, catching the subtle scent of the exhaust and the heated metal. "Start it up," he commanded Leo. The engine turned over with a sharp, high-pitched starter whine. When it caught, the garage was filled with a sound that should have been magnificent, but wasn't. Instead of the smooth, melodic roar it was famous for, it produced a rhythmic, metallic clicking, a sound like a frantic heart skipping a beat every few seconds. At idle, the silver body of the car shivered violently, the vibration visible in the side mirrors. Vanessa rolled her eyes, her patience finally snapping. "Listening to it won't help, Mr. Cruz. My engineers used ultrasonic sensors. The computer says the timing is perfect. The sensors say the oil pressure is optimal. It's a software glitch in the deeper architecture. It requires a server-side patch, not a man with a rag." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, his head tilted to the side. He wasn't looking for a warning light on a dashboard. He was listening to the frequency of the metal. He was feeling the way the air moved through the valves, detecting a microscopic turbulence that the digital sensors were programmed to filter out as noise. "The computer only sees what it's told to see," Daniel replied, with a faint, knowing smile. "Machines don't lie, Ms. Blake. They have a physical reality that code can't always capture. Only the people who interpret the data lie, or more often, they just don't know what they're hearing." The garage fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Daniel signaled for Leo to turn off the shop's radio. He gestured for the other mechanics in the adjacent bays to stop their impact wrenches. He wanted the room to be as quiet as a tomb, a vacuum where only the engine's voice existed. Vanessa looked annoyed, her foot tapping a rapid, impatient rhythm on the concrete, but the intensity in Daniel's eyes kept her quiet for once. "Start her again," Daniel said. As the V12 fired back up, the mechanical stammer returned, a tiny, nearly imperceptible hesitation in the third cylinder's cycle. To anyone else, it was just a high-performance engine being temperamental. To Daniel, it was a scream for help. He reached deep into the lower quadrant of the engine bay, his arm disappearing into the maze of burning hot pipes and titanium shields. He wasn't looking for a broken part. He was looking for a misalignment. The heat was intense against his skin, a reminder of the raw power contained within the cylinder walls. He could feel the minute pulses of the high-pressure fuel pump, identifying a slight rhythmic anomaly that bypassed the digital flow meters. It was a physical truth, buried beneath layers of electronic abstraction. Vanessa watched, her skepticism slowly being overtaken by a strange, uncomfortable fascination. She saw a man who moved with the absolute precision of a master surgeon. Daniel didn't use a wrench. He didn't use a pry bar. He used his fingers to locate a tiny, silver-plated differential pressure valve, a component so small and so deeply buried that most modern mechanics didn't even know it existed in this specific iteration of the apex block. He didn't replace a single part. He didn't spend a dime of her money. He simply applied a specific amount of pressure and a quarter-turn adjustment to a physical setting that the digital sensors were programmed to ignore as static. "That's it?" Vanessa asked, her voice skeptical but quieter now. "You just touched it? You turned a screw and you think that fixed $1 million failure?" Daniel stood up, his arms streaked with fresh grease. He wiped his hands on his rag once more, his expression unreadable. He looked at Leo and gave a single, firm nod. "Start her up." Leo turned the key. The garage was suddenly filled with a sound that felt like a physical force, a wave of pure, unfiltered power. The V12 didn't just start. It sang. The engine roared with a deep, resonant growl that immediately smoothed out into a purr so stable, so perfect, You could have balanced a wedding ring on the intake manifold without it falling. The shivering vanished. The metallic clicking was gone. The silver car sat perfectly still, its power humming with a lethal, magnificent grace that sent a literal chill down Vanessa's spine. She stood frozen, her jaw tightening as she listened to the mechanical perfection she had been told, by the best in the world, was impossible to achieve without a factory rebuild. She walked over to the car, tentatively placing her hand on the hood. It didn't vibrate. It just felt alive, a beast tamed by a man in a greasy t-shirt. "How?" she whispered, her eyes finally meeting Daniel's with a look of genuine, unfiltered shock. "My engineers spent weeks on this. They had telemetry data from the factory. They had every tool imaginable. They said it was a total system failure." Daniel leaned against his workbench, the oil on his shirt a stark, humble contrast to her pristine silk. "Computers only know what they are told to look for," he said, his voice calm and instructional. "They are programmed with ideal parameters. They don't know how the air feels when the humidity is at 80%. They don't know the sound of a valve that's struggling against its own housing because of a 2-micron expansion. You have to listen to the soul of the machine, Ms. Blake. You have to understand the physics of the metal, not just the logic of the code." Vanessa took a step closer, her suspicion replaced by an overwhelming, almost frantic curiosity. "Where did you learn to do that? Who are you? This isn't just local mechanic work. This is artistry. This is the work of the person who built this car." Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to dig up the past, but the look in her eyes, a mix of awe and burgeoning respect, demanded the truth. "I didn't just learn it," he said, his voice level and devoid of ego. "I helped design the early prototype for this specific block 8 years ago. I was the lead thermal dynamics engineer for the Cruz Holloway project." Vanessa's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks as if she'd seen a ghost. The Cruz Holloway project was the legendary foundation of her company's entire current engine line, a project that had revolutionized the high-performance industry before the lead engineer, the Cruz in the name, mysteriously vanished from the public eye at the height of his career. She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with trembling urgency. She searched the company's deep legacy archives. Within seconds, a black-and-white photo appeared from a press release a decade old. It was a younger Daniel, standing next to a wind tunnel prototype, looking exactly like the man in front of her, minus the grease and the years of quiet labor. She looked at the man, then the phone, then the man again. "You're Daniel Cruz? The Daniel Cruz?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You were the one who created the variable valve timing system we still use as our primary patent today. You're a legend in the industry. Why are you in a place like this? Why are you fixing trucks in the suburbs?" Daniel looked at the clock on the wall, a simple plastic thing that ticked away the seconds of his life. "Because in this place, I'm never late to pick up my daughter," he said simply. "And that's worth more than any patent." The atmosphere in the garage shifted instantly. The mockery was gone, evaporated like steam. The arrogance that had defined Vanessa Blake's entrance was replaced by a reverence that made the very air feel heavy and respectful. She was no longer the all-powerful CEO looking down on a common laborer. She was a student standing before a master who had forgotten more about her business than she would ever know. She realized with a sickening jolt that she had been insulting the very man who had built the foundation of the empire she now stood upon. "Mr. Cruz." "Daniel." "I am beyond embarrassed," she said, her voice dropping all pretenses of authority, becoming soft and sincere. "My company has been searching for your level of expertise for a decade. We've struggled with the new iterations of the V12 because we lost the original vision, the soul that you started. Our current team is brilliant with software, but they lack the feel for the machine that you clearly still possess." She stepped toward him, her eyes burning with a new kind of ambition. This time, it was not just about profit, but about recapturing a lost standard of excellence. She could see the potential for a complete technological rebirth under his guidance. "I want you to come back to the city," she said firmly, her CEO instincts kicking back in, though tempered with respect. "I will give you a contract as our global chief technical consultant. I'll quintuple your current income. I'll give you a private lab, a team of 20 hand-picked engineers, and a corporate office overlooking the park. We need you to lead the next generation of power plants. This garage, it's a waste of your genius. You could be changing the world again, Daniel." Daniel listened patiently, his arms crossed. He looked at the luxury car, a marvel of his own making, and then he looked at his messy, cluttered shop. He could see the allure of the offer. He remembered the thrill of the breakthrough, the prestige of the international auto shows, and the intellectual challenge of solving problems that had never been solved before. He thought about the financial security, the kind of money that would ensure Mia never had to worry about a thing for the rest of her life. But then he looked at his watch. It was 3:10 p.m. In exactly 20 minutes, his daughter would be standing in the school parking lot, clutching a drawing of a rocket ship, looking for his gray truck. He thought about the corporate meetings that lasted until midnight. He thought about the overseas flights to Germany and Japan, the high-pressure deadlines, and the crushing stress that had kept him away from his wife during her most difficult months. He remembered the feeling of being a success to the world, while being a stranger to the people he loved. He looked back at Vanessa, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I appreciate the offer, Ms. Blake. Truly. And I can certainly consult for you. I can review your blueprints, troubleshoot your prototypes via secure link, and offer my insights on your thermal mapping. I'm happy to help the project succeed." He paused, a small smile touching his lips. "But I won't leave this garage, and I won't move back to the city. I won't be your chief technical consultant if it means missing a single dinner." Vanessa looked genuinely baffled, her worldview unable to process a man turning down that much power. "Why? You're a legend. You're working on rusted pickups and minivans when you could be building the future of transportation. Don't you want to be part of history again?" Daniel's smile widened, a tired but profoundly happy expression. "My daughter already lost her mother to a world that moved too fast," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet shop. "She won't lose her father to ambition. To you, this engine is the future. To me, it's just metal and air, a clever arrangement of parts. The most important thing I'll ever build is a childhood for my daughter where her father is actually present, not just a name on a paycheck. I've already made history, Ms. Blake. Now, I'm making a life." Vanessa fell silent. For years, she had sacrificed everything, her personal life, her health, her relationships, for the sake of the engine of her career. She realized that while she had more money than she could ever spend, she was the one living in a cramped, dark space of her own making. Daniel, in his grease-stained shirt and his humble shop, was the one who was truly free. She nodded slowly, reaching into her bag to produce a simple, embossed business card. "We'll do it on your terms, Daniel. Stay here. Be a dad. But please, teach us how to listen again." Daniel arrived at the school gates exactly 3 minutes before the bell rang. He sat in his truck, the engine idling with a familiar, comfortable vibration that felt like home. When Mia ran out of the building, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders and a bright smile on her face, the world felt perfect. "Daddy!" she yelled, climbing into the passenger seat with a burst of energy. "Did you fix the big shiny car today?" Daniel leaned over and kissed her forehead, the smell of crayons and playground dust replacing the scent of gasoline in his senses. "I did, baby," he said. "It just needed someone to listen to it for a minute. It was just a little lonely for the truth." Mia grinned, buckling her seatbelt. "I knew you would. You can fix anything in the whole world." Daniel put the truck in gear, feeling a sense of peace that no corporate bonus or executive title could ever buy. Meanwhile, Vanessa Blake sat in the driver's seat of her silver supercar, parked at the edge of the suburb. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't check her emails or call her assistant. She just sat there for a long time, listening to the perfect rhythmic heartbeat of the V12 engine. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about the next quarterly report or the competition. She was thinking about Daniel's words. The silence of the car's cabin, now devoid of the frantic clicking, allowed her to hear her own heartbeat for the first time in a decade. It was a rhythm she had forgotten, one that had been drowned out by the noise of constant acquisition and corporate war. She closed her eyes and simply breathed. She realized that her own life had been clicking and shivering for a long time, a ghost in her own machine. And she had been ignoring the vibration by turning up the volume of her work. She put the car in gear and drove away, but she didn't speed. She drove slowly, enjoying the silence and the precision of the machine, realizing that the most powerful engines in the world are the ones that know when to slow down and just be. A week later, Vanessa returned to the garage. She wasn't driving the supercar. She was driving a sensible, high-end SUV, and she wasn't wearing a silk suit. She was wearing jeans, boots, and a simple sweater. Daniel looked up from a brake job on a local florist's van, surprised to see her back so soon. "Is there a problem with the V12?" he asked. Vanessa shook her head, a soft, genuine smile playing on her lips. "No, the car is perfect," she said. "I'm not here because the engine is broken. I'm here because I realized I don't know how to listen. Not to cars, and certainly not to people. I've spent my life looking at data points instead of reality." She looked around the shop, which now seemed less like a humble workshop and more like a sanctuary. "Can you teach my senior engineers how to actually hear the machines they build? And maybe, if you have time between pickups and homework, you can show me how you manage to find so much peace in a place like this." Daniel stood up and wiped his hands. He looked at Mia, who was busy coloring a picture of a garden. He looked back at Vanessa, seeing the woman who had mocked him just days before. He saw that her engine had finally roared to life, but it wasn't the one under the hood. It was her humanity, finally finding its rhythm. He smiled and pulled out a wooden stool for her. "It starts with silence," he said. "Let's sit down and see what the world is trying to tell us today." That day, a luxury engine wasn't the only thing that roared. The dignity of a father, the respect for true mastery, and the soul of a woman who had been lost in the noise were all restarted. Daniel Cruz was no longer just a mechanic in the eyes of the elite. He was the man who reminded the world that sometimes the most important work happens when you choose to stop, breathe, and finally listen to the heartbeat of what truly matters. If you believe that true value isn't found in a title or a price tag, subscribe to High TL Stories. We tell stories where quiet dignity defeats loud arrogance, and where true devotion always finds its way home.